Okay, then we can, I think, start. First of all, welcome everyone at this session about intelligent transport systems within the frame of the Nordic Perspective Summit 2020. So I will be just very brief. So my name is Claudio Roncoli. I'm assistant professor at Aalto University in transportation engineering. And I'm going to be the moderator of this session. So very briefly, a few practical arrangement for the session. So we're going to have 4 speakers. And more or less, each presentation will last around, at least each speaker will have a slot of about 25 minutes. And after the session, we're going to have a panel discussion of around 20 minutes in total with all the 4 speakers, and then open to questions from everyone, and we'll discuss about the topics. Practical side, so we're going to have questions and polls, and will be all handled in the Slido app. I think the ones of you who were already present in the morning should be already familiar with that. So remember to use the event code NPS 2020 and choose the right session. So I kindly ask everyone who has some questions for the speakers, either now or later during the panel, to put these questions into the Slido, and I will try to answer them, to ask them to the presenters in the best possible way. Then an additional part, again practical, we are going to have polls for each of the presentations. So just before every speaker starts, I will ask you some questions, and you're free to answer to those. Again, everything is Slido, and we'll try to discuss them with the speakers either right after the presentation or at the final panel, most likely. So let me just then enter in the inside the session. So the first talk. Well, first of all, first speaker is going to be Ian Sacs from Ramboll, and his topic is going to be about impact of COVID-19 on micromobility. So you can all start answering this poll very soon, immediately after I will have finished my introduction. Yeah, so I will now invite Ian to share his screen. I'm now stopping mine, and the floor is yours, Ian.
Thank you. Can you just confirm that you can see the screen?
We can see the screen.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I appreciate having the opportunity. My name is Ian Sacs. I'm a civil engineer by trade, but been working in the industry for about 20 years now. Started in the United States as a traffic engineer, and nowadays I work in Finland, but I work on projects internationally, typically on master planning level types of assignments. The company I work for, Ramboll, has about 16,000 people altogether, but the smart mobility team is a combination of transport planners from different countries around the world where we have offices, and we're about 200 people in smart mobility. So today we'll be discussing the pre-COVID-19 trends, some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had on micromobility, future impacts speculation, and then maybe if there's time, a little bit of discussion about the impacts to our energy use. So we can start off by saying that we have known for decades that most trips are short. I'm sure everybody in this seminar today is aware of that. And so there's always been an excellent opportunity to find sustainable ways to move around those short distances and not lean towards reliance on automobiles. Many places have gone through the exercise of also identifying how easy it would be and the potential there could be for people to use micromobility to get around. But that hasn't always been the case. It's only been in the last 20 years or so that many Western cities, at least, have embraced the idea of promoting walkability and bicycling in their communities. And in the past 10 years or so, we have seen kind of influx of different ways or business models in order to improve bicycle use and other micromobility vehicle uptake. In the past few years, it has really seemed to have gotten out of control in many cases, where tons of bicycles are made available everywhere. It's not just bicycles. We know that there's also other types of micromobility vehicles. In fact, the idea of micromobility comes from this kind of branching out of different smaller transportation options, lightweight, low speed. This is just one example of an attempt to define what micromobility is. This is done by ITDP, but of course, in general, small vehicles, low speeds are what falls under that umbrella. So the idea of micromobility, especially the e-scooter, is kind of idealistic when it's advertised and marketed, and it seems like a very convenient way to get around cities. But there's not just one of them, of course. There are more than one, and they do seem to multiply. Sometimes they arrive in our cities en masse. And when that happens, it becomes a little bit more cumbersome to manage, especially when people are unfamiliar how to use them, where to leave them. And there's cities, for the most part, have been entirely unprepared for the huge volumes of scooters and bicycles that have been arriving in cities over the past 5 to 8 years. There are also concerns about the individual safety of the users and the people around them, because these vehicles move at a faster speed than walking, but there usually isn't enough infrastructure to support use of these vehicles elsewhere other than on sidewalks, and so that causes major conflict and concern. There's also a major concern about the sustainability of the vehicles themselves. The life cycles, especially in the earlier generations, were so appalling that many of these vehicles were being replaced within 45 days, or at least on average, they were being replaced within 45 days, which is obviously not good, and certainly negates the low energy consumption aspects of the vehicle. So for the most part, micromobility or e-scooters, which kind of assumed the bad reputation for micromobility, quickly became referred to as an invasion, and cities were really struggling to cope, understandably so, and a bad reputation was gained overall by micromobility, especially e-scooters. But the funny thing is that invasion is meeting a huge demand. There's something unmet out there. There's a niche of trips that seems to be extremely well suited for micromobility, whether it's riding a bicycle or using an e-scooter or other modes. There is obviously that need, as we saw on that chart in the first slide, to be met, and so there is some value in this. So we have to ask ourselves, and this is what we were asking ourselves at Rambo as well: is it sustainable, or is there a way for micromobility to be sustainable in our communities? Not just about the environment, but economics, the business model, the environment, of course, and also socially. Can we find a way to make micromobility sustainable? So we began working with last year with a number of different cities around the world. All in all, we spoke with 15 different cities to develop a kind of a working methodology and identify what could be the commonalities across cities around the world. And we also partnered very closely with a city in New Jersey that I have a lot of experience with, Hoboken, and we tried to collect what we call the common strategic goals across cities around the world, and we zeroed in on 12 of them. The link here below is for you if you'd like to read the white paper that we produced about the green paper, sorry, that we produced about this, or you could just use the Google keywords of Rumble micromobility. But anyway, and I won't spend much time going through the results here, but we did identify 12 common or universal strategic goals that most cities seem to have in common. They're not always the same. They're not always prioritized the same way, and some of them don't apply. And one of them that's glaringly missing is the impacts of COVID-19, because we released this paper just a few days before we all started to hear and feel the big impacts of the pandemic. But interesting reading if this is something that you're involved in. With those 15 cities, as well as the operators Voi and Lime, and the regional policy guidance organizations of Polis from Europe and NACTO from the United States. I think we were able to collect a really interesting set of strategic goals, and also propose some measurable KPIs that communities can use to establish how sustainable their micromobility program is, and also allow them to benchmark against other cities. The categories, sorry, were in connectivity, in climate, in management of the programs, the costs of operating and managing the programs, public acceptance and user acceptance, safety, both for the users and the community at large, compliance with the rules and regulations that are put in place by the community, data access to make sure that certain data sets are available to the city, and also openly to the community to understand how these vehicles are working with the rest of the transport network. Equity, to make sure that different groups of within the community are being have fair access to these new modes of mobility. And also the economics of the programs with respect to the communities. Innovation, so how much do these programs actually contribute to most cities' innovation goals? And then finally, resilience. So can these programs complement most cities' resilience efforts? So here's a summary of the 12 universal strategic goals. And again, you're welcome to look at that document separately. But like I said, it happened, it was released right before we all fell into this strange new world that we're living in, caused by the coronavirus. That coronavirus, of course, resulted in cities trying to react and deal with an entirely unknown agent. And of course, even in public transport, there were attempts to keep the vehicles up and running and available and useful to the community. But all in all, what we saw, both by law and also by people's concerns, was that the streets became silent. And we saw that not only with our own eyes, but we saw it in photography, and we also saw it in the data, and lots of interesting changes in the way that our communities were operating on a day-to-day basis, both the residents and the visitors. Extremely high activity places became almost completely empty, and this experience that we have all had is one that just goes to show how much of an impact the importance of getting around is. So, like I said, public transport companies around the world attempted to continue to operate, and in some capacity they did, but of course the ability to support everyone who was commuting and wanted to commute before was drastically limited. And we saw, both by force but also afterwards, when people could continue to travel, that significant drops in use of public transport around the world. It was consistent everywhere. And but interestingly enough, even though even though the overall numbers showed a significant drop in public transport ridership, there was many subsets of our communities who had no choice but to continue to use public transport despite the risks because they needed to get to work. And there are plenty of data out there, but it's quite interesting when you see it broken down by these demographics that we thought that nobody was using public transport anymore, but it turns out that many of the people of color, for example, were still riding, if not riding more, public transport than before because the other options were limited. But it's not all doom and gloom. There was also some pretty positive things. If one could find a silver lining in the pandemic at the moment, one of them is certainly the case for micromobility. Huge uptake in the use of our streets for something other than driving cars. Lots of people choosing to ride a bicycle or take a scooter. Individuals were discovering the use of micromobility for the first time. Cities were discovering the value of reserving street space for vehicles other than cars, and in some cases, cities went out of their way to encourage people to use these alternative options as a way to compensate for the lack of public transport availability, and also a bit of fear that might result in a permanent shift towards driving. Many data analytics have shown us that at this time there's a great opportunity, perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for micromobility operators to seize the moment and get people on vehicles and get people using them as an alternative for public transport or for driving. We have seen that both in terms of the uptake of scooter use, for example, but also in many of our communities, you're on a waiting list in order to buy a bicycle. McKinsey has shown some really excellent data to demonstrate that while just like most other companies at the moment, in the short term, micromobility operators will take a hit just because overall trip activity is down significantly. In the medium and long term, micromobility operators are forecast to benefit from the current conditions as long as they continue to cooperate with communities in terms of how to keep their vehicles out on the streets. And the profitability is also expected to increase in the future years as well. McKinsey also goes to show that while we do expect some return to use of public transport modes, there will very likely not be for a quite long time a return back to previous levels. And so there needs to be something to fill the gap. Otherwise, we will definitely find ourselves in a jam. Something else that's interesting that McKinsey pointed out is that while in China, for example, over the past few months, airline seat capacity has returned almost back to normal conditions. So you could consider that maybe China's a few weeks or months ahead of other places around the world in terms of dealing with the pandemic. The travel for leisure has not returned, so hotel occupancy rates have not increased. So it's not expected that that tourism is going to come back very quickly either, even if there are more airline trips being taken. So it would be presumptuous for me to suggest or tell anybody what the future impacts of COVID-19 for micromobility will be. I think there's so much uncertainty in our world at the moment that nobody knows for sure. But I thought it would be helpful at least to posit a couple of questions that we in the transport community might find interesting for research collaborations in the coming months and years. Will micromobility companies survive the short-term impacts, or will they not be able to weather the storm? And will cities embrace micromobility to the, as part of their full menu of mobility options? All the friction and conflict that has existed between micromobility operators popping up in cities without consulting the cities and working carefully through the policies has created some bad blood between the two. And will cities be open-minded about them now? What changes can be made to micromobility public-private partnerships so those relationships can improve, and also to reflect the changes that are very likely going to happen in terms of the business models? And will cities be able to ensure equitable service and safety to all citizens? I think the pandemic has shown that many members of our community are underserved or not equitably served. And those data need to be leveraged towards improving accessibility to those members, to those groups in the community. How do we prevent this shift to car ownership and use? That is a big risk. I think that's perhaps one of our city's greatest risks in terms of transport planning. And we've got to have options, and so micromobility is I believe, has got to be part of that, part of the toolkit for that, to solve that problem. How can we leverage the work-at-home experiment to avoid congestion? I haven't talked about it that much here, but in my opinion, anyway, there are this experiment that we've been living in over the past 7 months or so has proven that while it's not perfect, and there's certainly a lot of bugs to work out in terms of working from home, both employees and employers have discovered that the transportation demand management measure that has been proposed to communities around the world for decades, but very few have taken it seriously, is actually an extremely useful and practical way to manage congestion, especially peak hour congestion. And we've got to act on that, and presumably we will. And even if the public side doesn't act on it quickly, the private side is already doing that to some extent. How do we reclaim our streets permanently? There are plenty of examples around the world that street space is being dedicated for walking and bicycling and other micromobility uses on a temporary basis. But how can we take actions to make sure that that space is claimed back permanently from car use and more fairly distributed across the trip needs of residents within our communities? And then finally, can cities repurpose infrastructure to improve the future balance of demand for micromobility and public transport? This is a big challenge. Business models and millions and billions of dollars, euros, currency in other countries have been dedicated towards public transport operations as we have known them until now, but it's very likely that they will never function the same way again. And if that's the case, is there a willingness and an openness to shift monies away from public transport operations and towards micromobility to create a better symbiosis between the two components of a full mobility package? I've also included here some questions about the impacts that COVID-19 and micromobility will have in the context of energy. Just thinking about how the changes are happening in terms of modal choice shifts and also shifts in trip types. So even though people are moving from one type of vehicle to another, they're also changing the way that that their daily trips are. We all know that because we're all experiencing that. We're of course experiencing a decrease in work commutes. Our trip activities within our neighborhoods are increasing because we're here more often. Our shopping trips are decreasing, and we are attending fewer large events. We are not going on vacations as much, or if we are, we're doing them more locally. So all these trip changes are definitely going to impact energy consumption, and they're certainly going to force some shifts away from longer distance modes to shorter distance modes such as micromobility. Okay, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure contributing to this session.
Hey, thank you very much, Ian. I was just thanking you for the very, very interesting presentation on the many aspects about micromobility that we need to face at some point in the future. I don't see any question in in Slido at the moment. So I will ask just one quick question myself. So one maybe of my main, let's say, personal concerns of micromobility is maybe inclusiveness. As at least the way we see it now, the way it's happening, it kind of maybe cutting out a few part of population that may not be keen or able to use these new kind of devices. Like I'm thinking mostly of elderly people, for example, or people with disabilities. Do you think? I mean, have you seen some studies looking into these issues, or do you think? I mean, this is a major problem, and how can we maybe tackle that?
Well, it's certainly a major problem because since these services are being provided by private operators, their focus is primarily profit-driven. Of course, it's natural, and so they're placing scooters, for example, e-scooters, in locations that are going to generate the most profit. The members of the community who are willing to pay for those vehicles, and where the trips are going to be most prolific. So this is where the relationship between the private operators and the public authorities is really important. You know, the cities need to establish policies and guidelines, and either through licensing or permitting schemes and so forth, they need to make sure that these services are being provided equitably. We have definitely seen that through data that, for example, elderly members of the community are significantly underserved by e-scooters, for example, mostly because they are a little less willing to jump on a vehicle like this and start using it. What we have seen, though, is that when individuals have used a vehicle like this even one time, then their opinion about the vehicle, both in terms of its value to the community and to their use of it in their daily trip activities, changes significantly. So that's also something that both the private and the public side can jump on and make an improvement on, is that they can introduce these vehicles in a way, in an equitable way, to different groups within the community. They can ensure that people who would otherwise not attempt to use it do get the chance to experience it and then make a more informed decision, as opposed to just looking at something that's zipping past them and only having perhaps that most negative experience with them. And then there are certain communities around the world that have done a fantastic job making sure that that micromobility vehicles are equitably provided around the community. In Hoboken, where we worked closely with the city, they included in their requirements that the vehicles were made available throughout the city, including in the areas that are government subsidized housing are located. And in Baltimore, Maryland, for example, that city has worked hand in hand with members of the community, different groups throughout the community, to actually build up the program itself from the ground up. So that is an excellent example. Baltimore is an excellent example of cities that really understand the importance of including different groups within the community to make sure that the programs are provided equitably.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. There is some question, but I would suggest, just for the sake of keeping timing, that this is asked at the panel session. So for now, I thank you once more, and I look forward to talk to you in a little while.
Thank you.